Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics. So, just how red will Trump's face go if the Supreme Court rules his tariffs unlawful and orders them to be dismantled and monies returned? I think there's a very good chance we're going to find out, because I was listening to a lot of the cross-examinations from the case. I have to say, I think the Supreme Court are actually going to rule against Trump here. Popcorn at the ready. So, couple of things I want to discuss here. The first is why I think the Supreme Court is getting ready to rule against Trump's tariffs. The second is what's going to happen, because Trump will hit the roof. A judgment against him on this, and this is a really high profile matter, that'll be humiliating for him and likely set him against both the court and Congress. I should be entertaining. But first, why do I think that the same Supreme Court, who've basically given him permission to commit murder, would block him on something as relatively benign as trade policy? Well, the way many justices gave a really tough time to Trump's advocate in the proceedings, Solicitor General John Sawyer, who, by the way, sounds like he's taken elocution lessons from RFK Jr.
Let me say two things in response to that. First, the notion that the taxes are all borne by Americans and are not borne by foreign producers whose goods are imported is empirically, there's no basis for that in the record. It's actually a mixed.
Well, who pays the tariffs? If a tariff is imposed on automobiles, who pays them?
Typically there'd be regardless of who the importer of record is, there'd be a contract that would go along the sort of line of transfer that would allocate the tariff, and there'd be different, sometimes the foreign.
His arguments made no sense. The most remarkable thing about listening to a lot of the arguments was I expected to struggle to follow them. Now, I've never really listened into Supreme Court deliberations in America, but I have in the UK. I'm not a lawyer. And I'm certainly not an expert in US constitutional law, but I'm not an expert in any form of law, right? So I expected lots of complex arguments, which I'd need to see explained in reports. But no, it was actually all quite straightforward to follow, because Sawyer was presenting the arguments of a child. In fact, his voice sounded like it was not just strained, but in a constant state of panic. Like a naughty boy, desperately trying to come up with more outlandish reasons why they shouldn't be punished. The crux of his argument was that the tariffs were about regulating trade, not raising revenues. So the government is not even trying to claim that Trump has tax-raising powers. So Sawyer argued the revenue raised was purely incidental. It's not the reason for the tariffs. But this is bollocks. First of all, tariffs are a tax. They're a tax on the American people. Second, Trump has boasted about the need for the revenue from the tariffs. He said he wants to replace income tax with tariffs, something that's not remotely feasible these days, but he's publicly stated it as his aim. He's also said that the tariffs are essential for closing the deficit. That would be the deficit he just widened with his rich guy tax cuts. And this was pointed out as well. Next, Sawyer tried to argue that if the court ruled against the government, it would lead to retaliation from other countries. No, there's already been retaliation from countries like China and Canada. It was in direct response to the Trump tariffs. Next, the issue here is not about whether the tariffs are necessary or even a good idea. The issue is whether Trump has the authority to impose them without Congress. After all, if there was a need for the tariffs, Congress could authorize them. However, the fact that Sawyer had bad arguments and no answers to the questions is neither here nor there. The Supreme Court has a 6-3 majority of conservative to liberal justices, thanks to Trump's handiwork during his first term. So they'll just listen to the ridiculous arguments and then find in Trump's favour, right? Well, it would seem not. 3 of the conservative justices were not only asking really tough questions, but they were responding by saying, "You're talking shit, mate." Not an exact quote, but words to that effect. So from my reading, and backed up by reports in the sensible news outlets, this is how it's breaking down. You've got 3 liberal justices. They're obviously going to find against Trump because the whole thing is ridiculous. Trump doesn't have the authority to levy taxes. That's Congress. Tariffs are taxes. Trump is not even trying to argue that he should be able to levy taxes, just that the revenue is incidental, not part of the plan. Then you've got 3 of the conservative justices who didn't really seem to say much at all. These are the ones who I suppose will just find in Trump's favour, no matter what the arguments are. But then another 3 justices were expressing extreme skepticism about Sawyer's arguments, basically calling them out, all of them. They were also responding approvingly to the counter groups who were presenting arguments against the tariffs, such as from business groups. Basically, from the way these middle 3 justices were responding, I would suggest it's impossible for them to find in favour of the tariffs at this point, because it's not just that they were asking tough questions, they were openly disregarding the answers. They were saying that is nonsense. I'll give you a specific example of one exchange. So Sawyer tries to deny that the tariffs are revenue raising, but regulatory, and that the revenues raised are incidental, not the point. He says that if Americans didn't pay the tariffs, if they just bought American instead of the imports, it would all work out fine. So then a justice asked, so why not do what the president does have the power to do and just block the imports then? If you're not after the revenues, why doesn't the president just block those imports? Force people to not even be able to buy the imports. Complete gotcha. No answer to that. Oh, sure, he opened his mouth and words spilled out, but he couldn't answer it because the president could just block the excess imports he doesn't like. That would be regulatory, which is within his power. Why not just do that? The answer, of course, is that the rest of the world would then absolutely retaliate. It's one thing to swallow unfair tariffs on your exports. It means you won't sell as much, but you'll still sell something, and it's American citizens paying the extra. But if the trade was blocked completely, well, then American exports would find themselves blocked. So American trade would grind to a halt. Trump wouldn't get his taxes, which his Solicitor General Monkey says aren't necessary anyway, but Trump says he needs to close the deficit. So listening to it and reading reports, it seems to me very, very likely that the Supreme Court is actually going to find against Trump here. And remember, of those 3 middle justices, shall we say, who were sounding extreme notes of caution against Sawyer's arguments, it only takes 2 of them to vote against this. So even if one of them folds, Trump will still lose. And that would be humiliating. I mean, think about the sequence, right? So first, the tariffs would have to be immediately lifted because they'd be declared unlawful. This is like in this country where the Supreme Court declared that Boris Johnson proroguing Parliament was unlawful. They just said, as far as we're concerned, Parliament's back in session. And there it was the next day. There'll be a couple of exceptions. I think the steel and aluminium ones were fine. I think some of the tariffs were within his power. It's the sweeping nature of them that's unlawful here, right? So they would have to be lifted. So most of the tariffs would have to be lifted. Second, because they were always unlawful, everyone who paid those tariffs will be due a refund. There's no way Trump could just take that in his stride. He would do his nut. He would start raging at the justices who voted against him. It might even be a line in the sand, which causes the Supreme Court to find against further power grabs, because this tariff policy is really a big test of Trump's authoritarian control. It's proper piss taken on an epic scale. If he wins it, he will then test the boundaries further. If he loses, as seems likely, it could mean he faces a major challenge to other aspects of his policies. After all, once the Supreme Court shows that it's not completely in his pocket, maybe others will call on them with more optimism over other issues. But then there's Congress. Because none of the justices are arguing that the tariffs shouldn't exist. It's not their job to judge a trade policy, good or bad. It's their job to determine who has the authority to impose the tariffs. So when they reveal their judgment, and if it's what seems likely, that if Trump wants those tariffs, he needs to get Congress to authorise them, then after his temper tantrum on Truth Social, he'll be forced to do just that. But will Congress rubber stamp them? I wouldn't bank on it. If it was that easy, Trump would have gotten them to do it in the first place. I mean, there is an extent to which Trump would have preferred it if he can just give orders and the courts and Congress just look the other way. There is a sense in which this tariffs policy could be seen as a way of testing whether or not Trump can just claim emergency powers whenever he likes, without question, by just going, national security issue. But Trump genuinely does want these tariffs. He wants it for his economic policies. It's not just for him a show of power. I think he would have just gotten Congress to approve them if he could. But the tariffs are unpopular. It seems doubtful Congress would approve of them. And if Trump is told that this is a piss take too far by both the highest court in the land and by Congress, what does that mean for his plans to take absolute power in the US? But similarly, if the Supreme Court finds in his favour, then that would be a green light to Trump that he can actually do whatever he likes simply by declaring it a response to a national emergency or security threat. And it looks like 3 of those Conservative justices are thinking exactly that. See, they have already shown that they're not impartial. They found in Trump's favour on other more than questionable matters. And they surely don't think trade policy is worth humiliating the president over and creating a massive schism between themselves and the White House and weathering the epic tantrum that will follow. But perhaps they are thinking about what would follow if they find in his favour here. Perhaps those 3 crucial justices have decided they don't mind America becoming more authoritarian, they're fine with that, but they don't want it sliding completely into full-on dictatorship. But let me know what you think in the comments below. For more content, you could subscribe to the channel or even join for access to streams and behind-the-scenes updates. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.